In the winter of 1943, the skies over Germany were no longer the impenetrable no-fly zone promised by Nazi propaganda. Instead, they had become a corridor of death where hundreds of Allied bombers, massive metal beasts, roared through the night. Leipzig, a city world renowned for its culture, its book fairs, and its music, was now a high-priority target. It wasn't just a critical rail hub. It was a massive industrial engine housing the factories that churned out the aircraft and weaponry essential for the Eastern Front. The German military boasted the most advanced air defense system in the world, the Himmelbett early warning radar network, dense thickets of flak guns, and elite night fighter squadrons. The government promised the people an invincible fortress Europe. Citizens in Leipzig were reassured that their public shelters and bunkers were engineered to withstand any assault. However, the reality of that winter would strip away those lies in the most horrific way imaginable. On the night of December 3rd, stretching into the early hours of the 4th, more than 300 RAF Lancaster bombers dumped thousands of tons of ordnance on Leipzig in a raid that lasted only 20 minutes. The attack ignited a massive firestorm that gutted the city center and swallowed residential neighborhoods. This wasn't a precision strike, it was area bombing with a tactic designed to shatter civilian morale and wipe urban infrastructure off the map. The raid exposed a lethal flaw in Germany's air defense and civil protection systems, a failure that turned the very bunkers meant to be safe havens into collective coffins. Hundreds of civilians trusting the state's promises rushed into public shelters beneath large buildings and train stations. But once inside, they faced an enemy even more terrifying than the bombs falling from the sky, the total collapse of the system. The tragic paradox was this: while the German flak guns were firing at full capacity and night fighters were scrambled to intercept the Luftschutz, the civil defense and crisis management system completely crumbled. Alarms were triggered too late, sometimes only minutes before the first bombs impacted, leaving people no time to reach proper safety. Even worse, shelters marketed as impenetrable lacked basic ventilation or were built with substandard materials to save costs. How did a military powerhouse that prided itself on efficiency fail so miserably to protect its own people? Was the absolute priority given to the front lines, so total that it hollowed out the home front? And what really happened in the suffocating darkness of those bunkers where hope and fear mingled in the final breaths of the trapped? The tragedy at Leipzig wasn't just about the loss of property. It was the total collapse of trust between the people and their government. It was a deep psychological wound, a truth buried under layers of propaganda about German resilience. Today we are reopening the files to find the truth, what really happened. Leipzig was a sitting duck for the RAF. Beyond the factories, the city's complex rail network was the primary vein for moving supplies to the Eastern Front. By 1943, Allied strategists shifted their focus toward dehousing and industrial paralysis. While the Nazis poured resources into massive flak towers around industrial zones, they ignored a critical shift in Allied tactics. Despite the legendary 88mm guns that could pick bombers out of the clouds, the German early warning systems were being blinded by window strips of aluminum foil dropped by the RAF to clutter radar screens. German night fighters, as skilled as they were, couldn't handle the sheer volume of a bomber stream. The defenses were simply overwhelmed. The December 3rd raid was a textbook example of the firestorm tactic. Pathfinders went in first, marking the target with flares and incendiaries. Following them, the main force dropped high explosives to open up the buildings, blasting away roofs and walls before raining down thousands of firebombs to ignite the exposed interiors. In the Leipzig disaster, the failure went beyond just failing to shoot down bombers. The Nazi regime had deprioritized the Luftschutz for years. While the wealthy had private reinforced bunkers, tens of thousands of working-class citizens relied on rushed public shelters or makeshift basement conversions. The most horrific scenes played out in the large public bunkers beneath office buildings and the central train station. Official Nazi records only listed general casualty numbers, but the ground reality was a nightmare. As the firebombs fell, the shelters became overcrowded death traps. At the Leipzig Central Station, hundreds of passengers and locals huddled underground, but the station was a primary target. When high explosive bombs hit, they didn't just collapse the structure. They ruptured high-pressure steam pipes and severed electrical lines. This unleashed two silent killers, scalding heat and carbon monoxide poisoning. The human perspective in that darkness is the heart of this tragedy. In a basement shelter near a radio factory, a young mother named Anna clutched her 4-year-old daughter. When the first bomb hit, the entire bunker shuddered. civil defense wardens slammed the steel pressure doors shut to isolate the room from the blast waves. But they soon realized the main ventilation shafts were choked with debris. Inside, the panic turned into a quiet, heavy terror. Carbon monoxide from the fires raging above began to seep into the room, replacing the oxygen. Adults began to feel dizzy and nauseous. Desperation set in as they realized they couldn't open the doors. The weight of the collapsed building above had jammed them shut. They were buried alive, unable to breathe. Even the air raid wardens were trapped, forced to witness their own helplessness. Meanwhile, on the surface, rescue crews were blocked by the firestorm. The heat on the streets was so extreme it reportedly melted glass and asphalt, making it impossible to reach the buried shelters in time. The Nazi tactical error wasn't just about intercepting planes, it was a failure to plan for the aftermath of total destruction. They lacked emergency exits, advanced carbon monoxide filtration, and proper evacuation training. Rather than facing the truth, the regime chose propaganda. Post-raid bulletins praised the bravery of the flak units while completely ignoring the thousands who suffocated in state-sanctioned death traps. The Leipzig tragedy is a stark reminder that in modern warfare, the front line is often in the heart of the city. Death came not just from the bombs, but from the systemic neglect of the very people the state promised to protect. The night of December 3rd claimed over 1,800 lives and left tens of thousands homeless. But those numbers don't tell the full story of those who died in silence, as the oxygen ran out. After the raid, the Nazi censors moved in. Bodies were quickly pulled from the rubble and placed in mass graves. Investigations into the causes of death, especially those linked to shelter design flaws, were strictly suppressed. Propaganda doubled down on the barbarism of the terror bombers, using the tragedy to fuel hatred while masking their own incompetence. Firefighters and rescue teams had been handed an impossible task. Fire had consumed 80% of the city center. The fatal flaw was that these bunkers weren't interconnected. Once the main entrance was blocked, there was no way out. It was a basic design failure caused by rushed construction and a lack of funding, as every spare cent was being funneled into the war machine. This exposes a cold moral gray zone. The Nazi regime was willing to sacrifice its civilians to keep the factories running. They covered up the shelter deaths to maintain morale and the image of a state in total control. The flag gunners did their duty, but the political leaders had gambled with civilian lives and lost. Leipzig was a turning point in the German psyche. No matter how loud the propaganda screamed about victory, the people realized Fortress Europe was a myth. The trust between the state and the people began to fracture as they realized the government couldn't or wouldn't keep them safe. The Leipzig shelter tragedy wasn't an accident, it was the direct result of a system that valued military targets over human lives. The failure of the civil defense system turned what should have been safe spaces into lethal traps. The deaths of hundreds by suffocation and entrapment serve as a haunting reminder of the cost of state-sponsored lies and blind military priority. It leaves us with a chilling question. In any total war, can a government truly prioritize the safety of its people over strategic goals? Or are tragedies like Leipzig an inevitable part of the organized destruction of modern conflict? Hit the follow button to keep uncovering the hidden files of history.